He was a millionaire marked by losses and obsessed with control. She, a simple maid who learned to hide from the world. But it only took a dress, a heel, and a glance to bring everything down. If you enjoy love stories and romance, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment saying where you're listening from. Let's continue. The rain beat against the windows of Blackwood Manor with an almost angry insistence, as if the sky was trying to wash away the sins of entire generations that had inhabited those somber rooms. Emma Davis adjusted the damp cloth between her fingers and continued polishing the marble of the main staircase, each movement precise and silent as she had learned in the last 10 years of her life. Her hands, small but calloused, slid across the cold surface, while her thoughts wandered far from this place she never managed to call home. At 23, Emma knew every architectural secret of the mansion better than her own dreams. She knew where the floorboards creaked, which doors groaned when opened, at what time the sunlight created perfect shadows to hide when the masters received important visitors. Her mother, Constance, had died 3 years earlier, whispering enigmatic words about unfulfilled duties and promises that needed to be honored. "There are things you must fulfill, my daughter," were her last words, pronounced with an urgency that Emma never fully understood. The sound of tires on the gravel driveway interrupted her thoughts. Emma raised her eyes through the side window and felt her heart race without being able to explain why. As a black imposing car parked in front of the main entrance, and from it descended a man she recognized immediately, even after 2 years of absence. Nathan Blackwood had returned. He walked toward the door with calculated steps, each movement emanating a natural authority that seemed to have intensified during his time away from home. His dark hair was longer, rebellious against the cold Boston wind, and a thin beard covered a face that had lost any trace of youthful softness. His broad shoulders moved under his dark wool coat like those of a predator returning to his territory after a long hunt. Emma instinctively retreated into the shadows of the staircase, observing through the wrought-iron balusters as Nathan entered the main hall. His eyes, so dark brown they bordered on black, scanned every detail of the environment as if cataloguing changes or checking if everything remained exactly as he had left it. There was something different about him, a coldness that didn't exist before, as if London had frozen not only his gestures, but also his soul. "Welcome back, Mr. Nathan," murmured Augustus, the elderly butler who had served the family for more than 30 years. His voice trembled slightly, not from age, but from nervousness. Everyone in the house had heard the rumors surrounding the return of the Blackwood heir, whispered stories about shady business, mysterious deaths, and a past he had left buried on the other side of the ocean. Nathan merely nodded, his eyes continuing their silent sweep of the environment until suddenly they stopped. Emma felt the air escape from her lungs when she realized he had found her among the shadows. For a moment, that seemed to stretch for hours, they stared at each other through the spaces between the balusters. She, kneeling on the upper steps with the cloth still in hand, and he standing in the center of the hall like a statue of dark marble. There was no recognition in his gaze, but something much more disturbing. It was as if Nathan was seeing something that others couldn't see, as if Emma were a piece of a puzzle he had just discovered was incomplete. The seconds dragged on as she felt every fiber of her body being examined by those merciless eyes, which seemed capable of reading thoughts and discovering secrets that even she didn't know she possessed. "Who is she?" asked Nathan, his deep voice echoing through the hall with a naturalness that made Emma shudder. The question wasn't directed at her, but at the butler, as if she were an object to be identified and catalogued. "That's Emma, sir, daughter of Constance, who worked in the kitchen. She takes care of the cleaning and organization of the house since her mother passed away," answered Augustus, his words carefully chosen to reveal no more than necessary. Nathan continued to stare at her for a few more seconds before looking away and heading for the stairs. Emma felt her body relax slightly, but when he passed her on the step where she was kneeling, she could feel the heat emanating from his body and the masculine scent that mixed leather, wood, and something indefinably dangerous. For a moment, she believed he might stop and say something, but Nathan continued climbing until he disappeared into the upper corridor that led to the main chambers. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. Lying in her small room at the back of the mansion, she stared at the ceiling while trying to understand what had happened in those few minutes in the hall. There was something in the way Nathan had looked at her that awakened sensations she didn't even know existed. a strange tingling in her lower abdomen, a quickening of her pulse that had nothing to do with fear, a dangerous curiosity about the man who had just returned from a self-imposed exile. She had grown up in that house, had witnessed Nathan in different phases of his life, the rebellious teenager, the young college student full of grand plans, the reluctant heir who left for London after a violent argument with his father. But the man who had returned was completely different from all these previous versions. There was a new darkness in him, an emotional density that seemed capable of sucking all the light around him. Emma got up and walked to the small window of her room, which overlooked the inner gardens of the mansion. The rain had stopped, but clouds still covered the moon, leaving everything immersed in a bluish penumbra. It was then that she saw him. Nathan was standing on the balcony of his room on the second floor, looking directly at her window. Even in the darkness, she could feel the weight of his gaze, the intensity of an attention that seemed physical. They remained like this for long minutes, separated by distance and darkness, but connected by something invisible and disturbing. Emma knew she should step away from the window, go back to bed and pretend nothing had happened. Instead, she remained there, silently defying that dangerous man who had again invaded her quiet life. When Nathan finally withdrew from the balcony, Emma felt a strange emptiness in her chest, as if something important had been removed from her life. She returned to bed, but sleep remained distant. Something had changed that night, something she couldn't name but knew would forever transform the silent dynamic that had always existed between the inhabitants of Blackwood Manor. Outside, the wind swayed the branches of the centennial trees that surrounded the property, creating dancing shadows that seemed to foreshadow storms much greater than the rain that had just passed. The days following Nathan's return brought a palpable tension to Blackwood Manor, as if the very architecture of the house had adjusted to accommodate the disturbing presence of the heir. Emma discovered it was impossible to maintain her routine of invisibility when Nathan seemed to always be in the wrong place, or perhaps the right place, to cross her path. He didn't speak to her, didn't smile, didn't make any gesture that could be interpreted as romantic interest or even basic cordiality, but he was always there, a silent and magnetic presence that observed her with the patience of a hunter studying his prey. When Emma organized books in the library, Nathan appeared to look for some specific volume, staying longer than necessary, while she felt his gaze trace each movement of her hands. When she watered the plants in the inner garden, he would appear on the upper balcony with a cup of coffee, pretending to admire Boston's urban landscape while devouring her with his eyes. At first, Emma tried to ignore this constant surveillance, convincing herself they were just coincidences or the fruit of her overstimulated imagination. But as the days passed, it became impossible to deny that Nathan Blackwood had developed a silent obsession with her, an obsession that began to awaken equally disturbing feelings in her. It was during the cleaning services in his private office that the tension reached almost unbearable levels. Nathan worked in silence, surrounded by papers and contracts related to the family business, while Emma organized the shelves and cleaned the mahogany surfaces with deliberately slow movements. She had begun to provoke him without even realizing it, loosening a few strands of hair from the severe bun she always wore, bending more than necessary to reach objects on the floor, allowing her cheap but sweet perfume to spread through the room when she passed close to his desk. "You don't need to clean that now," said Nathan on a Thursday afternoon, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Emma was polishing a crystal vase near the window, and the golden light of late afternoon created golden reflections in her brown hair. "I'm sorry, Mr. Nathan. I can come back later," she replied, feigning submission while her eyes met his for a fraction of a second longer than would be appropriate. "No," he said, rising from his chair with a fluid movement that made the muscles in his back tense under his white shirt. "Continue. I was just observing your technique." The word observing came out of his mouth laden with double meaning, and Emma felt a strange heat spread through her body. She continued polishing the vase, but now she was hyper-aware of each movement, of how her fingers slid across the smooth surface of the crystal, of how Nathan had moved close enough that she could hear his breathing. "Did your mother teach you to work like this?" he asked, his voice low and too close to her ear. "My mother taught me many things," Emma replied, turning slightly to face him, "especially about how to recognize danger when it's close." The smile Nathan displayed was more a showing of teeth than an expression of joy. "And do you believe you're in danger now, Emma?" It was the first time he had pronounced her name, and the way his deep and slightly hoarse voice shaped each syllable made something contract in her lower abdomen. "I don't know, Mr. Nathan." "Should I be?" They remained like this for long seconds, with only a few inches separating their bodies, his eyes scanning her face as if memorizing every detail. Emma could feel the heat emanating from his body, the masculine perfume she now instantly recognized, the sexual tension that hung in the air like electricity before a storm. "Everyone in this house should be," he finally answered, before moving away and returning to his desk as if nothing had happened. That night, Emma discovered it wasn't just Nathan who had developed an obsession. She found herself thinking about him constantly, about the way his dark eyes seemed to see through her defenses, about how his presence transformed mundane tasks into experiences charged with tension, about what might happen if one day he decided to touch her instead of just looking. It was a Friday when everything changed. Emma was cleaning the main hall when she heard voices coming from the office. Nathan was receiving visitors. Through the half-open door, she could hear fragments of a conversation about business, investments, and something about cleaning up the family reputation. One of the voices mentioned London and asked if that problem had really been resolved. "Some problems are never completely resolved," replied Nathan, his voice carrying a coldness that made Emma shudder. "Just managed." It was then that she heard her own name being mentioned. "And Constance's daughter, she still works here?" asked a female voice that Emma didn't recognize. "Still," replied Nathan, and Emma imagined she could feel his gaze piercing through the walls. "Why do you ask?" "Constance knew too much about many things. I hope she didn't pass that curiosity to her daughter." The silence that followed was so dense that Emma found it difficult to breathe. What secrets did her mother know? Why had she always insisted that Emma remain in the mansion even after her death? And why did Nathan seem to know more about this than she did? "Emma is different from her mother," Nathan finally said, and there was something in his voice that she couldn't interpret. Protection? Possessiveness? She knows her place. But as Emma silently moved away from the door, a certainty grew in her chest. She didn't know what her place was, but she was determined to find out. And if that meant challenging Nathan Blackwood and all his dark secrets, so be it. That night she began to search. She discreetly rummaged through the rooms where her mother used to work, looking for any clue about the mysteries that Constance had taken to the grave. It was in the old sewing room, a small and dusty space on the third floor, that she found something that would change everything. Hidden behind a loose floorboard, there was a diary wrapped in a black ribbon. The yellowed pages exhaled an old floral perfume, and the elegant handwriting on the first page revealed a name that made Emma's heart race. Helen Blackwood, Nathan's mother, the woman who had committed suicide when he was still a teenager. With trembling hands, she opened the diary and began to read. The first pages revealed the daily life of a bored socialite. But gradually the entries became more obscure, speaking of forbidden loves, family secrets, and a growing paranoia about being discovered. And then, in an entry dated 24 years ago, Emma read something that made her world collapse. "Constance came to see me today. She knows about me and Richard, knows about the son. I promised I would take care of her daughter if she kept our secret, but now I'm afraid this pact may destroy more lives than it protects." Emma closed the diary forcefully, her heart beating so loudly that she was sure the entire mansion could hear it. What child was Helen referring to? What secret had her mother kept? And most importantly, what role did she herself play in this web of lies and blackmail that spanned generations? When she finally managed to rise from the cold floor of the sewing room, Emma knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Nathan's looks, his silent obsession, her mother's insistence that she remain in the mansion. It all was part of something much bigger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The weeks following the discovery of the diary transformed Emma into a darker version of herself. She continued performing her tasks with the same precision as always. But now each gesture was calculated, each movement a piece in a game whose rules she was still learning. Helen's diary had become her obsessive nightly reading, and with each page she revealed deeper layers of a conspiracy that involved her own family in ways she had never imagined. Nathan, for his part, seemed to have developed a supernatural perception of the changes in Emma. His looks became more intense, his casual appearances more frequent, as if he could sense that she was hiding something important. During breakfast, when she served the main table, Nathan studied her over the financial newspaper with an intensity that made her skin tingle. When she arranged flowers in the entrance hall, he invented excuses to pass by multiple times, each passage accompanied by a look that seemed capable of reading her most intimate thoughts. It was on a Tuesday morning, while Emma was cleaning the family portrait gallery, that Nathan finally broke the pattern of silent observation he had established. "Did you know my mother?" he asked, appearing behind her with that disturbing ability he had to move in complete silence. Emma felt every muscle in her body tense, but forced herself to continue polishing the golden frame of a portrait of a Blackwood ancestor. "No, Mr. Nathan. She died when I was still a child. But your mother knew her well, didn't she?" The question was asked in a casual tone, but Emma could sense the trap hidden in each word. She turned slowly to face him, maintaining a neutral expression despite the whirlwind of emotions that bubbled inside her. "My mother worked in the kitchen. I believe all the maids knew your mother, at least by sight." Nathan moved closer, and Emma could see small scars she hadn't noticed before, one on his jaw, another near his left ear. Marks that told stories about what had happened during his 2 years in London. "Knowing by sight is very different from knowing intimately," he said, his low voice carrying a veiled threat. "My mother had few confidants. Your mother was one of them." Emma's heart was beating so hard that she was sure Nathan could hear it. Every word he uttered confirmed her suspicions about the secrets that Constance had taken to the grave, but also revealed that Nathan knew much more about all of this than she did. "I don't know what confidences you're talking about," she lied, keeping her gaze steady on his dark eyes. Nathan smiled, but there was no humor in that expression, only a predatory satisfaction that made Emma instinctively back up until her back touched the wall covered with portraits. "Of course you don't," he murmured, approaching until only a few inches separated their bodies. "You're too innocent to understand the games that previous generations played, too pure to understand that some lies are necessary to protect the people we love." The word love was pronounced as both a caress and a threat simultaneously, and Emma felt a shiver run down her spine when Nathan raised his hand and lightly touched a lock of hair that had escaped from her bun. "But innocence has an expiration date," he continued, wrapping the strand of hair around his index finger, "and you're beginning to ask questions that might have dangerous answers." "What kind of questions?" whispered Emma, hypnotized by his proximity and by the masculine scent she was beginning to recognize as exclusively Nathan's. "Questions about why your mother insisted you stay here after her death. Questions about why I observe you constantly. Questions about what really happened to my mother." Each word was accompanied by a slight tug on the strand of hair, a touch so subtle it bordered on torture, and Emma discovered that her breathing was becoming irregular. "And what if I already know some answers?" she challenged, surprising herself with her own audacity. Nathan's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Emma believed he might do something drastic. Kiss her, hurt her, or perhaps both. Instead, he released her hair and took a step back, but the smile playing on his lips was more dangerous than any explicit threat. "Then you're smarter than I thought," he said, "and infinitely more dangerous." That afternoon, Emma decided to directly confront the secrets that had shaped her life without her knowledge. She returned to the sewing room and spent hours reading each entry in Helen's diary, looking for clues about the true nature of the relationship between her mother and the Blackwood matriarch. It was in an entry dated 23 years ago that she found the missing piece of the puzzle. "Richard brought the child today. Constance was furious when she discovered I intended to legally recognize him. She said it would destroy the family's reputation and that she wouldn't allow it. She threatened to tell Edward everything if I didn't send the child away. I had to choose between my illegitimate son and my marriage. I chose the marriage, but this decision is slowly killing me." Emma let the diary fall from her trembling hands. Richard was the name of the head gardener who had worked at the mansion for decades before dying in an accident when she was still a teenager. A kind man with an easy smile who had always been especially kind to her. A man who, she now realized, had dark brown eyes exactly like Nathan's. The truth hit her like a punch to the stomach. Nathan had a half-brother, an illegitimate brother who had been rejected by the family and sent away to protect the Blackwoods' reputation, and her mother, Constance, had been the guardian of this devastating secret. But where was this lost brother now? And why did Nathan seem so obsessed with her if he didn't know about the connection between their families? The answers began to form in her mind when she remembered the words her mother had whispered on her deathbed. There are things you need to fulfill. Constance wasn't talking about household duties or loyalty to the masters. She was talking about a blood debt, about secrets that needed to be revealed or kept, about choices that Emma would have to make. When she finally left the sewing room that night, Emma knew she had crossed a line from which she could never return. She wasn't just a maid at Blackwood Manor. She was a fundamental piece in a story of family betrayal that stretched back decades. And Nathan, with all his silent obsession and predatory looks, might be both her destiny and her greatest danger. The weight of this revelation accompanied her as she walked through the somber corridors of the mansion toward her room. But when she passed by the library, a faint light caught her attention. Nathan was there, sitting in a leather armchair with a glass of whiskey in hand, looking directly at the door as if he had been waiting for her. "Found what you were looking for?" he asked, his voice echoing in the silence of the night. Emma stopped at the door, knowing that any answer she gave would forever change the dynamic between them. But the time had come to stop running from the dangerous truths that had shaped their lives. "Maybe," she replied, entering the library and closing the door behind her. "But there are still things I need to understand." Nathan smiled, a genuine smile for the first time since he had returned from London, and gestured to the armchair across from his. "Then sit down, Emma. It's time to talk about things our mothers never wanted us to know." The Blackwood Library had witnessed many conversations over the centuries, but none carried the electric tension that hung in the air that night. Emma settled into the leather armchair, her trembling hands smoothing her simple skirt, while Nathan observed her with that intensity that had become both familiar and disturbing. The dim light from the fireplace created dancing shadows on his face, accentuating the sharp angles that had become more pronounced since his return from London. "You read my mother's diary," said Nathan, not as a question but as a statement loaded with a certainty that made Emma swallow hard. "How do you know that I—" "Because you've changed," he interrupted, bringing the whiskey glass to his lips without taking his eyes off hers. "In the last few days, you look at me as if you're seeing a ghost, as if you know something that should frighten me." Emma felt her breathing accelerate. There was something in Nathan's voice, a carefully controlled vulnerability, that made her realize he wasn't just interrogating her. He was confessing. "And should it frighten me?" she asked, her own voice sounding lower and more intimate than she intended. Nathan set the glass on the side table and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees in a posture that decreased the physical distance between them without having to rise from the armchair. "That depends on what you discovered about our family, about what our mothers did to protect us from truths that could destroy us." "Our family?" repeated Emma, feeling her heart race at hearing Nathan use that possessive term. "Do you really believe it's a coincidence your mother insisted you remain here after her death? That it's a coincidence I returned from London exactly now when you turned 23? Nathan rose from the armchair with a fluid movement and began walking around her, like a predator circling his prey. "Do you believe it's a coincidence that I can't take my eyes off you since I returned?" Each word was pronounced in a hoarse voice that made Emma's skin tingle. She tried to stand, but Nathan placed a hand on her shoulder, keeping her seated with firm but not violent pressure. "Stay," he murmured, his mouth dangerously close to her ear. "It's time for you to know why your mother died keeping secrets that weren't hers." "My mother died of cancer," said Emma, but her voice came out uncertain. "Your mother died of guilt," corrected Nathan, moving to stand in front of her again. "Guilt for having participated in a lie that destroyed lives. Guilt for having helped my mother send away an innocent child to protect the Blackwoods' reputation." Emma closed her eyes, trying to process the implications of what Nathan was revealing. "You know about your brother," she whispered. "I am your brother." The words fell into the silence of the library like stones in a pond, creating shock waves that spread throughout Emma's body. She opened her eyes and stared at Nathan, looking for signs of lies on his face, but finding only a devastating truth. "That's impossible," she murmured, rising from the armchair with trembling movements. "You are Nathan Blackwood. You are the legitimate heir." "I am the illegitimate son of Richard Alvarez and Helen Blackwood," said Nathan, his voice laden with a bitterness that seemed to corrode his words. Edward Blackwood raised me as a son to keep up appearances, but he always knew the truth. Always reminded me that I was nothing but a mistake he had the generosity to cover up. Emma felt as if the floor was disintegrating beneath her feet. But then, who is the true heir? Nathan smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Edward died without leaving known legitimate children. The entire Blackwood fortune should go to distant relatives, or... He made a dramatic pause, his eyes fixed on her pale face. To late discoveries about the existence of other heirs. Emma's mind worked frantically, connecting pieces of a puzzle that was becoming more complex with each revelation. That's why you came back from London. That's why you observe me constantly. You believe I know where the real heir is. I know that you know, said Nathan, approaching until he could touch her face with the back of his hand. Because your mother wasn't just my mother's confidant. She was the guardian of secrets worth more than you can imagine. His touch was surprisingly gentle, contrasting with the tension emanating from his entire body. Emma found herself leaning her face against his hand, seeking comfort in a situation that was becoming more dangerous with each second. I don't know anything, she whispered. My mother never told me about heirs or secrets. She only said I had things to fulfill. And you do, said Nathan, his other hand finding her waist and pulling her closer. You have to help me find answers that could save or destroy us both. The physical proximity was affecting Emma's senses in a way she had never experienced. Nathan's masculine scent, the heat of his body, the intensity of his gaze, everything conspired to make her forget the dangers of the situation she found herself in. And if I don't want to get involved in this, she asked, even knowing she was already involved beyond any possibility of return. You have no choice, murmured Nathan, tilting his head until his lips almost touched hers. Just as I have no choice regarding what I feel for you. The kiss that followed was as inevitable as a storm after days of growing atmospheric pressure. Nathan kissed her with a desperate hunger, as if he were trying to absorb her essence through the contact of their lips. Emma responded with a passion that surprised her, her hands clutching his shirt, while she felt as if she were drowning in sensations she didn't know existed. When they finally separated, both were breathless, and Emma could see her own desire reflected in Nathan's dark eyes. This is madness, she whispered, but didn't move away from his arms. It's destiny, he corrected, his hands running down her back in a caress that made every nerve ending in her body awaken. You and I were raised in this house for this moment, to be each other's salvation or downfall. Emma knew she should resist, that she should run out of that library before it was too late. But when Nathan kissed her again, more slowly this time, savoring each second of contact, she understood that it had been too late for a very long time. They had been shaped by their mother's secrets, by the lies of previous generations, by the power games that governed Boston's high society. But at that moment, in the penumbra of the ancestral library, they were just a man and a woman consumed by a passion that promised both redemption and destruction. When Nathan finally released her from his arms, Emma knew she had crossed an irreversible line. She was no longer just a maid discovering family secrets. She was an active piece in a dangerous game where love and revenge walked side by side. Tomorrow we start looking for answers, said Nathan, his hoarse voice revealing how the kiss had affected him. Together. Emma nodded, knowing she had committed to much more than a simple search for buried truths. She had committed to Nathan Blackwood, with all his dark secrets and his consuming passion, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a spectator of her own existence, but like the protagonist of a story that promised to completely transform her. The days that followed the meeting in the library brought a subtle but noticeable change in the dynamics of Blackwood Manor. Nathan and Emma developed a silent language made of loaded looks, accidental touches that lasted seconds longer than would be appropriate, and seemingly casual conversations that contained layers of meaning that only they could decipher. The sexual tension that had always existed between them now had a different flavor, more urgent, more dangerous, tempered by the mutual knowledge that they were playing with fire. Emma discovered that knowing Nathan's true identity had intensified her attraction to him in ways she couldn't rationally explain. There was something deeply erotic about knowing that the man who watched her with predatory eyes was, in fact, an imposter living an elaborate lie for decades. Each gesture of authority he made, each order he gave to the employees, Each moment he exercised the power inherited from the Blackwoods became a seductive performance of rebellion and survival. Nathan, for his part, seemed to be fighting an internal battle between the desire to protect Emma from the dangers surrounding the truth about the family and the need to have her as an ally in the search for answers that could save or destroy them both. He had become more attentive without being obvious, ensuring she received the best tasks, intercepting conversations that could put her in uncomfortable situations, and creating opportunities for them to be alone without arousing suspicion from the other staff. It was on a Thursday afternoon that Nathan made a decision that would change everything between them. Emma was organizing books in the library when she found a cream envelope with her name written in an elegant and masculine handwriting. Inside, besides an amount of money that represented more than she earned in 3 months, there was a card with the address of an exclusive boutique in Beacon Hill and a phrase that made her heart race: "Be unforgettable." Hence, on the back of the card, a more detailed explanation: "Tonight there will be a gala dinner with international investors. Your presence will be necessary, not as a maid, but as my companion. Use the money to prepare yourself appropriately. I'll be waiting at 8. Emma read the note 3 times before she could fully process what Nathan was proposing. He wanted her to appear at the dinner, not as the kitchen maid's daughter, but as an equal. The audacity of the proposal was as shocking as it was exciting, but also dangerous in ways she could barely imagine. The boutique indicated by Nathan was the kind of establishment Emma had only seen from afar, with windows displaying dresses whose prices could pay her salary for an entire year. When she mentioned Nathan Blackwood's name, she was greeted by an experienced saleswoman who treated her with the deference reserved for the most important clients. "Mr. Blackwood called personally," explained the woman, guiding Emma through racks filled with exclusive creations. "He said he needed something that would reveal your natural beauty without being vulgar. Something that would make men stop breathing and women die of envy." The chosen dress was a work of art in black silk that embraced every curve of Emma's body, as if it had been designed specifically for her. The neckline was daring without being scandalous. The skirt flowed to her ankles with a hypnotic movement, and the back was almost completely open, held only by thin cords that created an intricate pattern on her bare skin. But the real transformation happened in the beauty salon attached to the boutique. The hairdresser cut her long hair at a length that framed her face dramatically, creating a sophisticated style that revealed the delicacy of her neck and the softness of her shoulders. The makeup was applied with professional expertise, enhancing her brown eyes with golden shadows and outlining her lips with a shade of red that promised both innocence and sin. When Emma looked at herself in the salon mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. There was something in her posture, in the way she raised her chin, in the confidence emanating from her eyes, that transformed her from an invisible maid into a magnetic and powerful presence. The return to Blackwood Manor was a surreal experience. The staff who had known her for years looked at her with a mixture of shock and admiration, some taking seconds to completely recognize her. Augustus, the elderly butler, went so far as to stumble slightly when she passed through the main hall, murmuring respectful greetings he had never directed at her before. But it was Nathan's reaction that validated the entire transformation. He was at the foot of the main staircase, adjusting the cuffs of the impeccable white shirt he wore under his black tuxedo, when she began descending the steps. The sound of her heels on the marble made him look up, and the expression that appeared on his face was so intense that Emma felt as if she were being physically touched by his gaze. Nathan completely stopped what he was doing, his hand frozen in the air while his eyes traced every detail of her transformation. There was something primitive and possessive in the way he visually devoured her, as if he were claiming ownership over a work of art he had personally commissioned. "My God," he murmured when she reached the last step, his hoarse voice laden with an admiration that bordered on reverence. "Is it how you wanted?" asked Emma, turning slowly so he could see the dress completely. The movement made the skirt float around her legs, and she noticed how Nathan's eyes fixed on the cords crisscrossing her bare back. "You're perfect," he said, approaching until he could touch her face with the back of his hand. "So perfect that I'll have to fight against the impulse to cancel the dinner and keep you all to myself." His touch sent waves of heat through Emma's body, and she leaned slightly against his hand, savoring the intimacy of the moment before they were forced to behave like polite strangers in front of the guests. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice low with vulnerability. "Why do you want me by your side tonight?" Nathan leaned in until his lips almost touched her ear, his hot breath making her shiver. "Because you're no longer just Constance's daughter," he murmured. "You're the woman who can help me claim what's rightfully mine. And because—" he paused as if fighting against his own words. "Because I can no longer imagine facing this without you by my side." The sound of voices coming from the dining room interrupted them, reminding them that the night was just beginning. Nathan offered his arm to Emma in a gentlemanly posture, but there was something in the tension of his muscles that suggested he was preparing for a battle. "Are you ready to meet the world that was always yours by right?" he asked, his words loaded with multiple meanings. Emma intertwined her arm with his, feeling the solidity of his muscles under the fine fabric of the tuxedo. "I'm ready for anything," she replied, and for the first time in her life she completely believed her own words. When they entered the dining room, the effect was instantaneous and devastating. Conversations stopped in the middle of sentences, champagne glasses were suspended in the air, and all eyes turned to the couple who had just made an entrance that would be remembered for years. Emma raised her chin and smiled, finally understanding the power a woman could exercise when she decided to stop hiding in the shadows. At her side, Nathan radiated a possessive satisfaction that made it clear to everyone present that the stunning woman on his arm was his exclusive property. The game had completely changed, and both were ready to play by the new rules they themselves had created. The dinner proceeded like a carefully orchestrated theatrical piece, where each guest played their role in Boston's high society, while Emma found herself at the center of an attention she had never experienced. Seated to Nathan's right at the main table, she observed the power dynamics unfolding around her, with a sharp perception that surprised her. The men courted her with flirtations disguised as education, while the women studied her with a mixture of curiosity and poorly disguised hostility. Nathan had introduced her simply as Emma Davis, an old family friend, a description vague enough to spark speculation, but precise enough not to raise immediate suspicions. Throughout the meal, he kept a possessive hand on her back or on her arm, a constant touch that served both to comfort her and to mark territory in front of the other men present. It was during the second course that Emma noticed a particular guest who seemed immune to her newly discovered charms. Marcus Vanderbilt was a businessman in his 40s, possessing a cruel beauty and a calculating look that made her feel like prey being evaluated by an experienced predator. Unlike the other men who disguised their interest behind polite conversations, Marcus observed her openly, with an intensity that made her skin crawl in distinctly unpleasant ways. "So, Nathan," said Marcus during a pause in the conversation, his voice loaded with a false cordiality that made Emma instinctively tense, "where have you been hiding this rare jewel? In all these years frequenting your house, I never had the pleasure of meeting Miss Davis." The smile that Nathan directed at Marcus could have frozen champagne. Emma has always preferred to maintain a discreet profile. She values her privacy. "What a waste," murmured Marcus, his eyes deliberately scanning the neckline of Emma's dress. "A woman with so much presence should be seen and admired. Don't you agree, darling?" The intimate way he addressed her made Nathan visibly tense, his hand slightly tightening around Emma's waist, in a gesture she recognized as both warning and protection. "I believe true elegance doesn't need to be constantly displayed," replied Emma, maintaining a polite but firm tone. "Some things are more valuable when they are rare." "Very well put," said a female voice from across the table. Emma turned to meet the emerald-green eyes of Isabella Montgomery, a socialite known for her glacial beauty and her sharp tongue. "Although I wonder if rarity is a choice or a necessity." The comment was said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and Emma immediately understood that she was being tested. Isabella knew exactly who she was, or at least suspected, and was probing to discover how much Nathan was willing to reveal or protect. "Sometimes necessity transforms into choice over time," replied Emma, sustaining Isabella's challenging gaze. "And sometimes we discover we had more options than we imagined." Nathan smiled at her response, and Emma felt a wave of satisfaction upon realizing she had impressed not only the guests, but also the very man who had brought her into this world. The rest of the dinner proceeded without major incidents, but Emma could feel the underground tensions that ran through the table like electric currents. There were untold stories, secret alliances, and ancient rivalries that shaped each interaction, each look, each carefully chosen word. It was during the break between dinner and drinks in the adjacent room that things became unexpectedly complicated. Emma had gone to the powder room to touch up her makeup when Marcus appeared in the corridor, discreetly blocking her exit. He was slightly drunk, his eyes shining with a predatory intensity that made her instinctively back away. "Finally alone," he said, approaching until she could smell the whiskey on his breath. "You're truly fascinating, Emma. There's something about you that reminds me of someone, but I can't identify who." "I'm sure it's just a coincidence," she replied, trying to go around him. But Marcus extended an arm, resting his hand on the wall and blocking her path. "Nathan always had good taste in women," he continued, his eyes scanning her body disrespectfully. "But you're different from the others. There's something more primitive about you, more real." "Please let me pass," said Emma, keeping her voice firm despite her growing nervousness. "In a minute," murmured Marcus, leaning in closer. "First, I want you to know that when Nathan tires of you, and he always tires, I'll be available to offer consolation." His hand touched her bare arm, and Emma felt a visceral repulsion that made her jerk away abruptly. But before she could respond, an icy voice cut through the air like a blade. "Take your hands off my companion. Now." Nathan was standing at the entrance of the corridor, and the expression on his face was more terrifying than any angry shout. There was a deadly coldness in his eyes, a promise of violence that made Marcus immediately back away, his hands rising in a defensive gesture. "Relax, Nathan. We were just talking," said Marcus, trying to sound casual, but Emma could detect the nervousness in his voice. "It didn't look like a conversation to me," replied Nathan, approaching with calculated steps. "It looked more like harassment." The tension in the corridor was palpable, and Emma realized she was witnessing something much more dangerous than a simple misunderstanding between gentlemen. There was history between these men, an old rivalry that went far beyond the current situation. "Perhaps we should return to the salon," she suggested, trying to defuse the situation before it escalated into something irreversible. Nathan looked at her for a moment, and she saw his expression soften slightly when he realized she hadn't been hurt. But when he returned his attention to Marcus, the deadly coldness returned. "If you touch her again," said Nathan, his low voice laden with threat, "I will forget we're at a civilized party." Marcus smiled, but there was no humor in the expression. "Careful, Nathan. Your violent temper has caused you problems before. I wouldn't like it to be repeated, especially now that you have so much to lose." The words were said as a deliberate reminder of something Emma didn't completely understand, but that made Nathan visibly tense. There were secrets being referenced, veiled threats that went far beyond the immediate situation. "Let's go," said Nathan, offering his arm to Emma without taking his eyes off Marcus. "The party is over for us." As they walked back to the main hall, Emma could feel the anger emanating from Nathan like physical heat. His muscles were tense, his breathing slightly accelerated, and there was something in his posture that suggested he was fighting against violent impulses. "Are you okay?" she asked when they were far enough from curious ears. "Should have broken his neck," murmured Nathan, his voice laden with a controlled fury that made Emma shudder. "Nathan, you don't understand," he interrupted, suddenly stopping and turning to face her. "Men like Marcus see women like you as trophies to be conquered. They don't care about feelings or consent. They take what they want and discard it when they tire." The intensity of his reaction revealed something much deeper than simple protection. There was possessiveness in his fury, a primitive jealousy that transformed each look directed at Emma into a personal affront. "And you?" she asked, brave enough to challenge the darkness she saw in his eyes. "Are you different from them?" Nathan stared at her for long seconds, as if he were fighting against his own words. When he finally responded, his voice was hoarse with emotion. "I'm worse," he admitted, "because they want to possess you temporarily. I want to possess you completely forever, body, soul, every thought, every breath, and that scares me more than any enemy I've ever faced." The raw and honest confession left Emma speechless. There was something simultaneously terrifying and exciting in the intensity of his passion, in the way she had become the absolute center of his emotional universe. When they finally left the party, both knew that something fundamental had changed between them. Nathan's jealousy had revealed the depth of his feelings, but also the potentially dangerous nature of his obsession with her. And Emma, for the first time, began to question if she was prepared to deal with the full intensity of love from a man like Nathan Blackwood. The weeks following the gala dinner brought a radical change to the routine at Blackwood Manor. Emma was no longer treated as a maid by the other staff. A subtle but noticeable transformation manifested in respectful greetings, lighter tasks, and a deference she was still learning to accept. Nathan had made it clear, without ever explicitly saying the words, that she now occupied a special position in the house's hierarchy. But with this new position came new dangers and responsibilities that Emma was only beginning to understand. It was on a Tuesday morning, while organizing documents in Nathan's office, that she found something that would forever change her perception of the secrets surrounding her family. Among business contracts and bank correspondence, there was a folder marked Private Investigation Alvarez Family, and inside it, photographs and documents that made her blood freeze. The first photograph showed a young man of humble appearance but with a gentle face, carrying a small child in his arms. On the back, a notation in Nathan's handwriting, Richard Alvarez, 1995, with unidentified child. The second photograph was more recent and showed the same man, now older, working in a garden she immediately recognized as being Blackwood Manor's own. But it was the third photograph that left her breathless. It was an image of herself at 15, talking with Richard near the rose bushes in the garden. On the back, another notation, Emma Davis, possible family connection with Richard Alvarez. Investigate. With trembling hands, she continued examining the documents. There were birth certificates, death records, and extensive correspondence with private detectives, whom Nathan had hired to investigate the family connections between the Alvarezes, the Davises, and the Blackwoods. The truth emerging from the papers was devastating. Richard Alvarez hadn't died in an accident, as she had always believed. He had been murdered, and the evidence suggested that someone within the Blackwood family itself had ordered his death to protect secrets that could destroy the dynasty's reputation. Even more shocking was the discovery that her own identity was being questioned. There were documents suggesting that Constance Davis might not have been her biological mother, but rather a woman who had agreed to raise her to protect her from an even more dangerous truth. Found something interesting? Nathan's voice made her startle, and she turned to find him standing at the office door, observing her with an expression impossible to decipher. There was something in his eyes, guilt, perhaps, or resignation, that confirmed her worst suspicions. You knew, she said, not as a question, but as an accusation. All this time, you knew who I really am. Nathan closed the door behind him and approached slowly, as if dealing with an injured animal that might flee at any moment. I suspected, he admitted, his voice carrying a painful honesty. Since I returned from London, there was something about you that seemed familiar to me. Not physically, but essentially. That's why you watched me constantly. That's why you brought me to the dinner. I was just a piece in your chess game. Emma's voice trembled with anger and disappointment, and she felt tears burning her eyes. At the beginning, perhaps, said Nathan, approaching until he could touch her face, but she jerked away abruptly. But that changed long before I was certain about anything. Changed how? When? It changed the moment I realized you weren't just a clue to unraveling the past, but the only person who could give me a future worth living. The sincerity in his voice almost made her yield, but the pain of betrayal was too fresh, too intense to be ignored. Who am I, Nathan? Who am I really? He sighed deeply, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of frustration that she had learned to recognize. You're Richard Alvarez's daughter, he said finally. My half-sister. The words fell between them, like a death sentence, and Emma felt as if the floor was disintegrating beneath her feet. The revelation wasn't completely unexpected. The clues were all there in the documents, in the photographs, in the way Nathan looked at her as if he were seeing a ghost. That means, she began, but couldn't finish the sentence. That means you're a legitimate heir to the Blackwood fortune, completed Nathan. Edward may have raised me as a son, but you're true blood. You have rights I'll never have. And what I felt for you, what I still feel. The words left her mouth like broken whispers. It's wrong, said Nathan, but his voice carried no conviction. It's forbidden. It's... He moved closer to her again, and this time Emma didn't back away. It's the only real thing I've ever felt in my life. Nathan, we can't... We're not real siblings, he interrupted, his hands finally touching her face, drying tears she hadn't even realized were falling. We weren't raised as family. We don't share childhood memories or family emotional bonds. We're just two people who discovered they have a father in common. Society would never accept it. Your reputation, your position. To hell with society, said Nathan with a vehemence that surprised her. To hell with my reputation. Do you think I care about anything besides you? He kissed her then, with a desperation that spoke of fear of losing her, of forbidden love, of passion that defied all social conventions. Emma responded to the kiss, even knowing she was crossing a line that society would consider unforgivable. When they separated, both were breathless, and Emma could see her own conflict reflected in Nathan's dark eyes. There are more things you need to know, he said, his forehead resting against hers. About how Richard died, about why Constance agreed to raise you. About the enemies we have and the dangers we face. Tell me everything, she whispered. I don't want any more lies between us. Nathan nodded, leading her to the armchairs near the window where they could talk without being overheard. Richard discovered that Edward wasn't my biological father, he began, his voice low and controlled. He also discovered that Helen had left a part of the inheritance to me in her will, a significant amount that Edward had hidden all these years. When Richard threatened to expose the truth, Edward ordered him to be permanently silenced. Edward killed my father, said Emma, the words coming out as a cold statement. Edward hired whoever killed your father, corrected Nathan. But the result is the same, and now that Edward is dead, the people who executed his orders are nervous. They know I know the truth, and they know you might be an even greater threat. That's why Marcus was looking at me that way at the dinner. He knows who I am. Marcus was one of the executors of Edward's orders, confirmed Nathan, his voice laden with hatred. And now he's trying to decide whether to eliminate you as a threat or use you as a weapon against me. The magnitude of the dangers surrounding them began to form in Emma's mind, and she understood that her life had changed in ways that went far beyond discoveries about kinship. What are we going to do? She asked. We're going to survive, said Nathan, taking her hands in his. We're going to expose the truth about Richard's death. We're going to claim what is rightfully ours, and we're going to do it together, come what may. Even knowing that we are, especially knowing that, he interrupted, because now I understand why I felt this connection with you from the first moment. It wasn't just physical attraction or romantic interest. It was recognition. It was my soul recognizing yours. Emma closed her eyes, trying to process all the revelations and emotions bombarding her. When she opened them again, there was a new determination in her gaze, the same determination that had driven Richard to fight for the truth, even knowing the risks. Then let's fight, she said. Let's expose all the secrets, claim our inheritance, and face anyone who tries to stop us. Nathan smiled, a genuine and proud smile that completely transformed his expression. Now you're talking like a true Alvarez, he said. Like a true fighter. The discovery of Emma's true identity brought a dangerous closeness between her and Nathan that manifested in increasingly intense and difficult-to-control ways. They spent hours in the office, supposedly planning how to expose Richard's killers, but frequently lost themselves in intimate conversations that revealed deep layers of their personalities. Nathan told about his lonely childhood, raised by a man who had never truly loved him, while Emma shared memories of her adoptive mother and the constant feeling that there was something important she couldn't understand about her own existence. The sexual tension between them had become almost unbearable. Each accidental touch, each prolonged look, each moment they were alone was charged with an electricity that promised both pleasure and destruction. Nathan visibly fought against the impulse to touch her more intimately, his hands closing into fists when she leaned over the documents they examined together, allowing him to smell her perfume and feel the heat emanating from her body. It was on a rainy Thursday that everything changed in an unexpected and devastating way. Emma was in the library, reading more entries from Helen's diary, when Augustus appeared at the door with a grave expression that immediately put her on alert. "Miss Emma," he said, his formal voice masking an evident concern, "Mr. Nathan has requested your presence in the main hall. There are important visitors." When Emma arrived at the hall, she found Nathan standing near the fireplace, wearing a dark suit that accentuated the tension in his shoulders. At his side, in an elegant but cold posture, was Isabella Montgomery, the socialite she had met at the gala dinner. But there was something different about Isabella today. A subtle possessiveness in the way she positioned herself close to Nathan, an intimacy that made Emma's stomach contract uncomfortably. "Emma," said Nathan, his voice strangely formal, "Isabella had some news she thought you should hear personally." Isabella smiled, but the expression didn't reach her emerald green eyes. "Actually, they're developments that affect us all. Nathan and I have decided to make our relationship official." The words seemed to echo in the hall like gunshots, and Emma felt as if she had received a punch to the stomach. She looked at Nathan, searching for signs that this was some kind of act, but found only a cold mask she couldn't decipher. "Congratulations," she managed to murmur, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. "Thank you," said Isabella, extending her left hand to display a diamond ring that must cost more than Emma would earn in several lifetimes. "The ceremony will be in 3 months. Small, intimate, just family and close friends." "Isabella," interrupted Nathan, his voice carrying a warning that only Emma could detect. "Perhaps we should discuss the details later." "Of course, darling," said Isabella, but there was a cruel satisfaction in her voice that revealed each word had been carefully calculated to cause the maximum possible pain. "Emma, I hope you'll remain in the house after the wedding. Nathan said you're indispensable to the functioning of the mansion." The way she pronounced the word indispensable made it clear she knew exactly what the nature of the relationship between Nathan and Emma was, and that the engagement was as much a declaration of possession as a demonstration of power. "If you'll excuse me," said Emma, keeping her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions devastating her inside. "I have tasks to complete." She left the hall with controlled steps, but as soon as she reached the corridor, she began to run. She climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, past the sewing room where she had discovered so many secrets, and continued until she reached the abandoned terrace that offered a panoramic view of Boston. There, finally alone, she allowed the tears to fall freely. The betrayal she felt was deeper than any physical pain. Nathan had promised they would face everything together, that their love was more important than any social convention, and now he was marrying another woman, as if nothing had happened between them. "You shouldn't have run," Nathan's voice made her turn abruptly. He was standing at the entrance to the terrace, but had kept his distance as if knowing she might flee again if he approached too closely. "Why?" she asked, not caring that he could see her tears. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I have no choice," he said, his voice laden with an anguish that mirrored hers. "Marcus made direct threats against you. He said if I didn't back off, he would ensure you met the same fate as Richard. So that's your solution? Marry Isabella. Isabella is the only person with enough power to protect you from Marcus and others who want our destruction. She has connections, resources, influence that I don't have alone." Nathan approached slowly, and Emma didn't back away this time. When he touched her face, drying her tears with his thumbs, she could see that his own eyes were moist. "Do you believe I want to marry her?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Do you believe I can imagine touching her, kissing her, pretending love for her when every fiber of my being belongs to you?" "Then don't do it," whispered Emma, covering his hands with hers. "Let's run away. Let's go far from Boston, far from all these power games and vengeance, and live as fugitives for the rest of our lives, always looking over our shoulder, always afraid they'll find us." Nathan shook his head. "You deserve more than that. You deserve a life worthy of Richard Alvarez's daughter." "I deserve you," she said, pulling him closer. "I deserve the man I love, regardless of the circumstances." "Emma." She kissed him before he could continue protesting, pouring all her pain, love, and despair into the contact of their lips. Nathan responded with a hunger that spoke of a man who knew he was losing the only thing that really mattered in his life. When they separated, both were trembling, and Emma could see the internal struggle devastating Nathan reflected in his dark eyes. "There is another option," he said finally, his voice so low she had to move closer to hear. "But it's dangerous, and it will require you to trust me completely, even when it seems I'm betraying that trust." "What option?" "Isabella doesn't just want to marry me. She wants the Blackwood inheritance. She believes by marrying me she'll have access to everything." Nathan paused, as if carefully considering his words. But she doesn't know about you. Doesn't know you have legal rights to the fortune she covets. You want to use her. I want her to help us destroy Marcus and the others, without knowing she's doing it. I want her to believe she's controlling me when, in fact, we'll be using her resources to expose the truth about Richard's death. It was an audacious and extremely risky plan, but Emma could see the logic behind it. Isabella had the means to protect them from powerful enemies, but she also had her own ambitions that could be manipulated. And afterward? After we expose the truth about my father. Afterward, said Nathan, pulling her into his arms, we'll cancel the wedding, claim our inheritance, and live our life together without hiding from anyone. It's a very dangerous plan, murmured Emma, but there was growing determination in her voice. All the best plans are dangerous, he said, kissing her forehead with a tenderness that contrasted with the hardness of his words. The question is, do you trust me enough to go through the next few months pretending you've lost my love to another woman? Emma looked into his eyes, seeing in them a vulnerability he rarely allowed others to see. He was asking her to endure emotional torture for the sake of a future that was still uncertain, to pretend indifference when each day of separation would be agony. I trust you, she said finally, but there's one condition. Which? During this time you can't touch her. You can't kiss her. You can't do anything that suggests real intimacy between you. Nathan smiled for the first time since she had arrived at the terrace. That won't be a problem. The only woman I want to touch is here in my arms. He kissed her again, sealing a pact that would take them through months of deception and danger, in the hope that in the end they could emerge free to love without restrictions. But both knew that the coming months would test not only their courage, but the very strength of the love they claimed to feel for each other. The months following Nathan's engagement were the most torturous of Emma's life. Watching the man she loved play the role of the devoted fiancé while maintaining a calculated distance from her was corroding her soul in ways she hadn't imagined possible. Nathan kept his promise not to show real intimacy with Isabella, but public appearances required him to be attentive, gallant, and convincingly devoted to his future wife. Isabella, for her part, had taken command of the mansion with an authority that revealed her true ambitions. She reorganized the staff, redecorated several rooms according to her personal taste, and treated Emma with an icy courtesy that made it clear she knew her true position in Nathan's life. There was no explicit cruelty, but a constant series of small humiliations, requests for Emma to serve tea during important meetings, comments about how touching it was that Nathan kept old servants out of sentimentality, and subtle suggestions that perhaps it would be better if she looked for employment elsewhere after the wedding. It was during this period that Emma discovered how far Nathan was willing to go to protect her and execute his plan of revenge. On a Friday night, 3 weeks before the wedding, Emma was awakened by strange noises coming from the lower floor. It was almost 2 in the morning and the mansion should have been completely silent. Wearing only a robe over her nightgown, she cautiously descended the stairs and noticed there was light in Nathan's office. Through the half-open door, she could hear low, tense voices. Nathan was talking with someone, and the tone of the conversation suggested it wasn't a social meeting. "Are you sure he'll confess?" Nathan was asking, his voice carrying a coldness Emma rarely heard. "With the evidence we have, he won't have a choice," replied a male voice she didn't recognize. "The bank records, the photographs, the phone recordings. Marcus is cornered. When they realize we know about all the murders he executed for Edward, he'll try to make a deal. And if he tries to escape, he won't succeed. We've had men observing his every move for weeks. Tomorrow night, during the bachelor party Isabella organized, we'll confront him with the evidence. It will be public enough that he can't simply eliminate us without causing an international scandal." Emma felt her heart race as she understood that Nathan had orchestrated an elaborate trap to capture the man responsible for her father's death. But she also realized he had kept this plan completely secret from her, violating the promise that they would face everything together. "And Emma?" asked Nathan, making her move closer to the door. "Will she be safe?" "That's the most delicate point," admitted the stranger. "When Marcus realizes he's lost, he'll likely try to use her as a bargaining chip. He knows how much she means to you. Then she can't be at the party. Nathan, you need to consider the possibility that it might be necessary to..." temporarily isolate her, for her own protection. The silence that followed was tense, and Emma held her breath, waiting for Nathan's response. "I know," he said finally, his voice laden with a sadness that made her heart tighten. "I've already arranged everything." Before Emma could fully process what she had heard, she felt a presence behind her. She turned to find Augustus, the elderly butler, accompanied by two men she didn't know. "I'm sorry, Miss Emma," said Augustus, his voice genuinely sorrowful. "Mr. Nathan's orders." She tried to run, but the men were faster. They didn't use violence, but were firm, escorting her to a wing of the mansion that had been deactivated for years. There she discovered that one of the rooms had been carefully prepared for her temporary stay. Comfortable furniture, books, food, everything she might need except the freedom to leave. "It's for your own safety," explained one of the men, avoiding looking her in the eyes. "Mr. Nathan asked us to tell you that everything will be resolved in 48 hours. When the door closed and she heard the key turning in the lock, Emma allowed herself to cry for the first time in weeks. Nathan had promised they would trust each other, that they would face the dangers together. But when the crucial moment came, he had chosen to protect her by keeping her prisoner. The hours that followed were psychological torture. From the room where she was confined, Emma could hear the preparations for the party, voices of staff organizing the hall, deliverymen bringing flowers and drinks, musicians testing equipment. She knew that somewhere in the house, Nathan was preparing for the final confrontation with her father's killers, and she was completely powerless to help him or even to know if he was safe. It was on the following night, when the sounds of the party were at their peak, that everything fell apart. Emma woke from a restless nap to the sound of screams coming from the lower floor. They weren't screams of celebration, but of panic and confusion. She ran to the window and could see police cars and ambulances arriving at the main entrance of the mansion, their red and blue lights creating sinister patterns on the walls. The door to her room opened abruptly and Nathan entered, but there was something drastically different about him. His suit was disheveled. There was a dark stain that looked like blood on his shirt, and his eyes had a wild intensity that frightened her. "We have to leave. Now," he said, pulling her by the hand. "What happened?" "Nathan, are you hurt?" "Marcus is dead," he said, his voice strangely calm considering the circumstances. "He tried to shoot you when he discovered where you were hidden. I had to kill him." The words hit Emma like shockwaves. "You killed him?" "It was him or you," said Nathan, pulling her through the dark corridors of the deactivated wing. There was no other choice. They reached a back exit that Emma didn't even know existed, where a car was waiting with the engine running. Nathan gently pushed her into the back seat before joining her. "Where are we going?" she asked, trying to process the speed with which her life had changed again. "Away from here," said Nathan, pulling her into his arms. "The police will want to ask questions. Isabella will try to use the situation to take control of everything. We need time to plan our next move. And the wedding." Nathan smiled for the first time in weeks, but there was something dark in the expression. "I think we can consider the engagement officially cancelled." As the car moved away from Blackwood Manor, Emma looked through the rear window and saw the house where she had grown up, where she had discovered her true identity, where she had fallen in love with a man who had just killed to protect her. She knew she was leaving behind not just a place, but an entire version of herself. "I'm sorry for keeping you prisoner," said Nathan, his voice low and laden with remorse. "I know I broke my promise to trust you." "You were trying to protect me," she replied, intertwining her fingers with his. "But next time, let me choose my own risks." "Next time," he promised, kissing her forehead. "We'll face everything together, come what may." But both knew there were still battles ahead. Isabella wouldn't easily give up the Blackwood inheritance. The police would ask questions about Marcus's death, and they still needed to legally prove that Emma was Richard's daughter and had rights to the family fortune. However, for the first time in months they were truly free. Free from the lies, the acts, the power games that had dominated their lives. They were just Nathan and Emma, united against the world, ready to fight for the future they had chosen together. The car continued into the Boston night, taking them toward an uncertain destination, but one they would face side by side, as it should have been from the beginning. 6 months later, Emma was standing on the porch of a colonial house in Cape Cod, observing the golden sea of late afternoon while feeling the salt breeze caress her face. The house had belonged to Richard Alvarez, a property he had bought in secret years before his death, using money he had saved over decades of dedicated work. It was a simple but charming refuge, surrounded by gardens he himself had designed, a place where he could have lived in peace if he hadn't been murdered for trying to claim the truth. The months of exile in Cape Cod had been simultaneously the most difficult and the most revealing of Emma's life. Away from the oppressive luxury of Blackwood Manor, she and Nathan had learned to live as ordinary people, cooking their own meals, taking care of the house, building a routine based on simple needs instead of power games. But they had also faced the traumas of everything they had lived through, the scars left by years of lies and manipulations, and the need to build an identity together that wasn't defined by the secrets of the past. Nathan was different away from Boston. The calculating coldness that had characterized him at the mansion had given way to a genuine vulnerability that he allowed only Emma to see. He talked about nightmares where he relived the moment he killed Marcus, about the constant fear that his actions might have irredeemably stained his future with her, about the daily struggle to build a life based on love instead of vengeance. "The latest news arrived from Boston," said Nathan, appearing on the porch with an envelope in his hands. "Our lawyers finally succeeded." Emma turned to face him, her heart accelerating at seeing the expression of relief on his face. In recent weeks, a legal team hired with Nathan's last resources had worked tirelessly to prove Emma's true identity and establish her legal rights to the Blackwood inheritance. "And?" she asked, hardly daring to hope. "You are officially recognized as Emma Alvarez Blackwood, legitimate daughter of Richard Alvarez, and legal heir to 40% of the family fortune," said Nathan, a genuine smile illuminating his face for the first time in months. "Isabella tried to contest it, but the DNA evidence and the documents we found were irrefutable." Emma felt her knees weaken, and Nathan caught her in his arms before she could fall. 40% of the Blackwood fortune represented more money than she could spend in several lifetimes. But more important than that was the official recognition that she wasn't just a maid who had fallen in love above her social position. She was a legitimate heir who had conquered her place by right. "And you?" she asked, concerned about how the revelation of her true identity would affect Nathan's position. "I keep 30% as Edward's adoptive son," he said, kissing her forehead. "Isabella gets the remaining 10% and some minor properties, but she lost the chance to control the Blackwood Empire. Does that mean we can return to Boston?" Nathan paused, as if carefully weighing his words. "We can return whenever we want, but the question is, do you want to go back?" Emma looked around at the simple porch, at the gardens her biological father had planted with his own hands, at the sea that offered a peace she had never found in the opulent mansion where she had grown up. In recent months, she had discovered a version of herself she didn't know existed, a woman capable of simple happiness, of love without complications, of dreams that didn't involve vengeance or power games. "I want it to be our choice," she said finally. "Not an escape, not an imposition of circumstances, but a conscious decision about how we want to live." Nathan nodded, perfectly understanding what she meant. "Then let's do this right. Let's go back to Boston, resolve all pending legal matters, confront anyone who still has problems with our relationship, and then decide where we want to build our life together." "Our relationship," repeated Emma, touching his face. "Is that still what we have, after everything we discovered about our family?" "It's more than that," said Nathan, pulling her closer. "It's what it always was. From the first moment you descended those stairs like a queen claiming her throne. We're not just half-siblings who fell in love against all odds. We're two people who recognized each other at the soul level, who faced hell together and emerged stronger." He knelt then there on the simple porch of Richard's house and removed a small box from his pocket. Inside was a ring that wasn't as extravagant as the diamond Isabella had displayed, but that shone with an honest beauty that perfectly reflected the love they had built. "Emma Alvarez Blackwood," he said, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. "Will you marry me? Not because we're convenient for each other, not because we need to unite fortunes or satisfy social expectations, but because we choose to build a life together based on love, truth, and mutual respect." The tears that ran down Emma's face were of pure joy. There was no fear, doubt, or hesitation, only the absolute certainty that this was the moment she had been waiting for all her life without. even knowing. "Yes," she said, extending her hand for him to place the ring. "Yes, Nathan Blackwood. I want to marry you. I want to face any scandal, any judgment, any obstacle the world might put in our way." When he stood and kissed her, there was nothing forbidden or wrong in the feeling that consumed them. It was pure love, earned through suffering, tested by adversity, and strengthened by the conscious choice to be together. 3 months later, they married in a small ceremony on the beach in Cape Cod, with only a few carefully chosen witnesses. Emma wore a simple white silk dress that danced with the sea breeze, and Nathan looked more handsome than she had ever seen him, relaxed and genuinely happy for the first time since they had met. Augustus was present, having decided to leave the Blackwood service to work for the couple in their new life. 40 years serving this family," he said during the small speech at the wedding dinner, "and I finally see a marriage based on true love instead of convenience." When the festivities ended and the guests departed, Nathan and Emma remained alone on the beach, watching the stars reflected in the dark water. "You know what's most ironic?" said Emma, leaning against her husband's chest. "I spent my entire life feeling invisible, and it took discovering I'm heir to a fortune to realize what I really wanted was to be seen by just one person. And I spent my entire life pretending to be someone I wasn't," replied Nathan, kissing the top of her head. "Until an extraordinary woman showed me I could be loved for who I really am, not for what I represent." They returned to Boston 6 months after the wedding, not as fugitives or rebels, but as a powerful and united couple who had earned the right to write their own rules. They bought a modern house in Beacon Hill, far from Blackwood Manor, which they sold to a museum, transforming the place of so many lies and suffering into a space dedicated to preserving history. Emma established a foundation in Richard Alvarez's name, dedicated to helping domestic workers' children obtain higher education. Nathan used his business experience to transform the family inheritance into ethical ventures that benefited underprivileged communities. Isabella tried to cause scandals in the first few months, spreading rumors about the incestuous relationship between the half-siblings, but discovered that high society had little interest in judging a couple who possessed as much financial power as determination to use their influence positively. 1 year after the wedding, while Emma was organizing the last of Richard's documents that had been found in a bank vault, she discovered a letter he had written shortly before his death. The words, intended for the daughter he had barely known, contained a prophecy that had become reality. "My dear Emma, if you're reading this, it means the secrets have finally come to light. I know your life won't be easy, that you'll face judgments and obstacles that will seem impossible to overcome, but you have a fighter's blood in your veins, and I believe you'll find someone who will love you not despite your humble origins, but because of the strength and dignity they gave you. Be happy, my daughter. It's all a father can wish for." That night, Emma showed the letter to Nathan and both cried, not from sadness, but from gratitude for having found each other against all odds, for having built a love that survived family secrets, power games, and even the social conventions that tried to separate them. They had begun as master and servant, discovered they were half-siblings, faced killers and manipulators, and emerged as husband and wife, united by a passion that transcended any social or biological category. And when people asked how they managed to be so happy despite all the adversities they had faced, Nathan always answered with a smile, "Because we discovered that true love knows no rules." "Que just is," Emma would complete, "and when you find the person who recognizes your soul, nothing else matters. Not the past, not the judgments, not the obstacles, just the future you choose to build together." And so they lived, not as a fairy tale, but as two real people who proved that love can indeed conquer everything, as long as both are willing to fight for it to the end.